Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. K. Anil Kumar, Assistant Professor, Discipline of Anthropology, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Today we'll discuss about the module Tribes of the World, a glimpse from the paper Tribal Cultures of India. So students, let us see what we are going to learn in this module. First, we are going to learn about the distribution of tribes in the world. Second, colonialism and the tribes. And third, ethnographic studies of tribes. And at the last, fourth, contemporary situation of the tribal rights in India and the world. Now, discuss about tribes of the world. According to the United Nations Permanent Forum, it is estimated that there are more than 370 million indigenous people spread across 90 different countries in the worldwide. Out of 370 million indigenous people, about 70 to 80% of them live in Asia. In the world, there are over 5,000 different languages and ethnic cultures of indigenous peoples, ranging from the forest people of the Amazon to the tribal people of India, and from the Inuit of the Arctic to the Aborigines in Australia. In India, the scheduled tribes are notified in 30 states and union territories, and the number of individual ethnic groups etc. notified as a scheduled tribes, that is in 705. The tribal population of the country as per 2011 census is 10.43 crore, constituting 8.6% of the total population, and 89.97% of them live in rural areas and 10.03% in urban areas. Studies have shown that the majority of these tribal peoples are identified as minority in most countries as opposed to the mainstream society and cultures. The tribes are known by different names in different countries. For example, in Australia, they are called as Aborigines. In China, they are called as minorities. And in North America, they are called as natives. And indigenous people in South America and in Southeast Asia. In India, they are called scheduled tribes, Adivasis, Janjatis, Vanvasis, and Hill tribe, etc. Except for the uncontacted tribes, mostly located in different terrain like the Brazilian Amazon forest and the cut-off islands like in Andaman Islands, the tribal population around the world have been influenced by modernization and globalization. In international law, the discourse on tribes as the indigenous people or original inhabitants is contested, influencing academia and policy making. Various human rights organizations and transnational bodies like the United Nations, the World Bank, and Survival International are taking up measures to recognize the rights of indigenous people. The events leading up to this movement is not inconsequential, but conscious human activity and cultural contacts have radically transformed the tribal societies, including empires like the Aztec and Incato food gathering pygmies of Ituri forest. In today's context, tribes as a cultural whole is a problematic concept since there is immense cultural contact and the tribes are no longer isolated or semi-isolated, but many have become parts of larger national and or cultural, either by force or choice. In this context, the difficulty of defining tribe and the problem of conceptualization in a context like India have added more confusion. Be that as it may, in the 21st century, tribal identity is no longer localized, as tribes across international boundaries have begun to reassert their identity and grievances on the common platform. And of late, the tribal political rights and cultural identity are being addressed in international forums and also promulgated in international laws. On 13 September 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The declaration roughly included about 370 million indigenous people in Asia, America, and Pacific Europe. These events leading up to this movement reflected 500,000 of encounter between the Old World and New World, beginning with the Christopher Columbus discovery of the New World in AD. In a nutshell, the tribes of the world have changed tremendously, and therefore the objective of this theme would be to understand tribes of the world both in its historical context and as communities in transition. Colonialism and tribes. In history, it was the European colonialism that radically transformed the history and culture of tribal communities. Many scholars agree that the intrusion of Europeans into the tribal areas first began with Christopher Columbus' discovery of the New World in 1492. In history, there has been an exchange of cultural traits and ideas and movements of people through the means of trading, war, conquest, and alliances among people groups. But by comparison, the impact of European colonialism by far remains an important point of departure in the relation between tribal people and outsiders, with far-reaching implications. At this juncture, anthropologists emerge as experts on tribal and primitive societies. The role of anthropology and its association with colonialism is still debated, but the development of fieldwork tradition under doyens like Franz Boas in United States and Bronislaw Malinowski in United Kingdom paved way for new perspectives on primitive peoples and tribes. This new methodology gave rise to production of what was as tribal monographs, focusing on holistic study of tribal communities. Mostly, both students in the United States carried on this tradition, and the influence of Malinowski remained pertinent in British anthropology. The European colonialism brought people into contact never like before. This led to newfound interest among the Europeans in the people they had colonized. Here, the Europeans found advanced cultural traits in the form of architecture, philosophy, literature, and technology in places like China, Japan, and India. But with respect to the tribal population, the prejudiced notion of bizarre beliefs and rituals like headhunting, human sacrifice, cannibalism, primitiveness, and violence was mostly used in the description of tribes. Generally, colonial agents like soldiers, travelers, missionaries, and civil servants are deemed indispensable to the whole colonial enterprise. Nevertheless, on an institutional scale, the agreements, treaties, and policies introduced by the colonial state had massive impact on the tribal communities. In retrospective, assimilation has been the most common policy of national states in dealing with the indigenous and tribal populations. For instance, in Australia, the state-sponsored program of assimilating Aboriginal population into the mainstream society had devastating effects, gaining the notoriety of what is known as lost generation. In common parlance, the entire continent was declared an unoccupied territory where Australia was colonized in 1788 despite being inhabited by more than 2 million Aboriginal people. In fact, until 1967, the tribal people were denied civil and political rights by the state. The diaries of explorers and soldiers, writings of missionaries, travelers, and philosophers were the first attempt to describe the tribal people and societies. Anthropology, which emerged at the backdrop of European colonialism, was seen as aiding the colonial interest and projects. Anthropologists took it as their objective to study the primitive societies and cultures as a specialized discipline. For example, in Japan, the state's assimilation policy has completely overrun the Ainu society and culture, the Aboriginal people of the northern island of Hokkaido, starting from the 19th century. While in South America, the tribal population have faced centuries of exploitation, subjugation, and disenfranchisement at the hands of the colonial empires and authoritarian states. This dates back to the first major European Native American encounters during the 6th century when the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro, representing the King Charles I of Spain, defeated the Inca Emperor Ataulfa, beginning the conquest of the New World and the fall of Aztec and Incan empires. Consequently, the intrusion of the external state had marginalized and pauperized communities like the Mapuche of southern Chile, the Maya people of Guatemala, and the tribe of Amazon Basin. In Chile, the state had pursued a unilateral policy of assimilating the tribes during the 19th and 20th century, which has come to be known as Chilenization. So students, now we'll discuss about the world's tribal situation. Tribal people today are part of nation states, although the relation between modern nation states and tribes varies from one country to other country. The nation state politics has been a vital factor in determining the destiny of the tribal peoples. There are many issues facing the tribes in India today's context. But the impact of nation states on tribal communities is an important factor determining the survival of tribal cultures and identity. The recent discourse of indigenous and tribal people rights in international forums is in regard to the inclusion and exclusion of tribes in nation building and tribal rights to self-determination. The understanding of tribes in the 21st century requires critical gaze from the lens of political dynamics of nation states. Anthropologists studying nation state recognize that every known tribal society is identified as a part of the state, although the nature of relationship between tribes and the state varies significantly across nation states. There are many issues facing the tribes in today's context, but the impact of nation states on tribal communities is an important factor determining the survival of tribal cultures and identity. In this regard, tribal communities around the world are differently positioned in relation to the state. Many tribal communities today comprise the most deprived and marginalized section of the nation state. This condition is observed in almost every continent having tribal population. the problems of marginalization, pauperization, loss of traditional lands and forests have become a persisting issue. In most cases, the developmental projects of nation states have come at the cost of displacing and exploiting the tribal peoples. For example, in the Brazilian Amazon forest, more than 70 uncontacted tribes are facing destruction of their home and forest from poachers, illegal loggers, and drug smugglers. This is expected to be disastrous as these tribes are vulnerable to newer diseases which they have no resistance. The recent discourse of indigenous and tribal peoples' rights in international forums is in regard to the inclusion and exclusion of tribes in nation building and tribal rights to self-determination. The understanding of tribes in the 21st century requires a critical gaze from the lens of political dynamics of nation states. In this regard, tribal communities around the world are differently positioned in relation to the state. Many tribal communities today comprise the most deprived and marginalized sections of the nation state. This condition is observed in almost every continent of the tribal people populations. For example, in Ecuador, the Amazonian tribe are being displaced due to logging, oil extraction, and commercial farming. The indigenous Aymara and Atacamino in Chile are fighting for their ancestral water source, which has been affected due to mining operations. In Africa, the hunter-gatherers are the most affected group, with most facing decline in population and loss of traditional lands and forest. The Batwa have lost their forest land due to establishment of wildlife sanctuaries by the Ugandan government, and thereby their mobile hunting gathering lifestyle is affected, reducing them mostly to landless laborers. In central India and Southeast Asia, many tribes are displaced due to development projects like mineral extraction, construction of dams, and establishment of government wildlife and forest reserves. For example, in Southeast Asia, the tribal struggle against the state pertains mostly to loss of land and forest. The Bakam Dam in Malaysia is estimated to have displaced more than 7,000 indigenous peoples from the area, with the clearing of 80,000 hectares of rainforest, while the San Roque multi-purpose project in the Philippine Cordillera region has affected thousands of indigenous people. The Penang in Malaysia have reported to be struggling against illegal logging, destroying their traditional homes. The Montagnard indigenous people in the central highlands between Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia have been affected by conflicts with reports of human rights abuse and mostly living as a refugees scattered inside Laos and Thailand without legal protection. The problem of land alienation, loss of traditional homes and forest is a pressing issue among the tribal people. This is also a common feature in almost every continent with the tribal population. According to the United Nations study, about 80% of the world indigenous population and tribal people identified belong to Asia. The process of assimilation of tribes into nation state has been less than perfect in Asian countries. In India, the tribes of northeastern states have been embroiled in decades of separatist movement against the Indian state. In what has been deemed a fight for self-determination, militancy and guerrilla warfare has occupied a chunk of tribal politics among tribes like the Bodo, Karbi, Kuki, Mizo and Naga. In central India, many tribes are displaced due to development projects like mineral extraction, construction of dams, and establishment of government wildlife and forest reserves. For example, the construction of Sardar Sarovar Dam on Narmada River in Gujarat is displaced lakhs of tribal people in India. Out of that, mostly farmers depending on lands have lost their livelihood. In Chittagong Hill tracts of Bangladesh, tribes like the Chakma and Marma traditionally practicing jhum cultivation are struggling to protect their traditional lands. Many have been rehabilitated as refugees in Indian neighboring states. It is estimated that the construction of Kaptai Dam alone had displaced about 1 lakh people, mostly Chakmas. In Sri Lanka, the oldest aboriginal group, Vania Leto, in local term it is called Vedda, is facing decline in population and loss of ancestral homeland. Originally, forest dwellers practicing hunting gathering, the Vania Leto livelihood had been adversely affected due to the development projects and mass immigration, and also the state's assimilation policy has affected their cultural identity and traditional lifestyle. In international law, the discourse on tribes as indigenous peoples or original inhabitants is contested, influencing academia and policy making. Various human rights organizations and transnational bodies like the United Nations, the World Bank and Survival International are taking up measures to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. In 1995, a decade for indigenous peoples was declared, and the United Nations instituted a forum of indigenous peoples headed by a special rapporteur to deliberate on the issues of tribes and indigenous peoples. Tribal rights. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples was adopted on 17 September 2007. The declaration delineated the rights of tribes and indigenous peoples and their protection in international law. In the midst of this, on Human Rights Day 1992, the United Nations declared the International Year of the World Indigenous Population or World Indigenous People. The struggle for recognition, which began as early as 1920s under the aegis of International Labour Organization. The International Labour Organization Convention 169 gave a comprehensive list of the rights of tribes and indigenous people. The main objective of International Labour Organization 169 was on the self-determination of tribal peoples. The issue of tribal rights today is being taken by international bodies and forums like the United Nations, World Bank and NGOs. Today, the tribal representatives and forums are coming together to assert their identity and rights on a common platform. The question of tribal rights and identity has transcended traditional barriers and boundaries and are becoming transnational in character. So students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. As we know that we have learned about the distribution of tribes in the world, colonialism and tribes and ethnographic studies of different tribes and the tribal rights in the world. And now we'll conclude this summary by studying an ethnographic study of Naga scholar. A Naga scholar completing his PhD from Oxford Divinity School has become a success story among an illustrious Angami tribe in the contemporary context. Belonging to Kohima from Kawishwa clan, his village was known for prolific headhunting, raids and slave trading, and also led to the 1898 Naga uprising against the British rule. In Kohima, he preaches Christian forgiveness and reconciliation in Baptist churches to weary Naga believers perplexed by gun violence among warring Naga rebel groups when they are not fighting Indian armies for political self-determination. Like the Nagas, the allure of nation state based on ethnic line had influenced many tribes in British India northeast frontier in the post-colonial period with far-reaching implications. While in the Andaman Islanders among the hunting-gathering Jarwa who had been relatively isolated, he threw aside the signpost that says, "Do not feed the Jarwa." News of vulnerability of Jarwa women to sexual exploitation from outsiders are being reported. In central India, in certain pockets, the Bihor, who have been subsisting mainly as animal trappers and food gatherers, are being reduced to scavenging and rag picking for sustenance as their traditional forests and hunting grounds are shrinking in size. While in other parts of the world, globalization and modernization have penetrated even the remote corner of the tribal areas. This is reflected in the Intu and Sami using snowmobile, refrigerator, and other modern equipments as a part of their daily livelihood. A Maori entrepreneur having access to the best business school in New Zealand and running a successful business. Aborigine teenagers in the Australian outback wearing Nike shoes and listening to American pop music. Navajo activists fighting to gay rights in their community. An Angami girl winning coveted model context in national television in India and so forth. Most of the tribal societies in the 21st century are at the forefront of globalization. As a result, most of the tribal communities are witnessing tremendous social and cultural change. These processes are changing the understanding of tribes and nature of tribal societies. Thank you.